Police, get down on the ground!
Over the course of this video, we will examine whether or not the US will remain the world's dominant superpower. During this video, we will be assessing the state of American political, military, economic, and technological power to assess whether or not the US will be triumphant by the end of the century, as it was in the last. Let's start off with the structure of its government and politics. The US is not a direct democracy, but rather a constitutional federal republic. This means that rather than ordinary people voting on any random policy, people elect representatives to enact those said policies. In other words, the much despised politician. The US government is split into three main branches: the legislative branch, i.e. Congress, which creates bills, the executive branch, led by the president, which executes laws by signing them, and the judicial branch, which presides over legal rather than political matters. This system is in place to prevent one side from gaining too much power over the others. The framers of the Constitution were well aware of the fragility of democracy and republics, given their knowledge of ancient Athens and Rome. So, in order to deal with this, the US government is based on a balancing act, as it doesn't place too much power in one branch, as opposed to the parliamentary system in which the executive and legislative branches are tied together. Under a presidential system, power between the executive and legislative branches is split, and oftentimes the legislative branch, i.e. Congress, arguably has more power than the president himself. This is a double-edged sword, since on one hand, it makes sure that American institutions remain robust in the face of any autocratic pressures, but on the other hand, it also makes American policy highly susceptible to partisan gridlock and stagnation, as the presidential system requires some degree of bipartisanship and consensus to pass bills, unlike the parliamentary system in which the party in power oftentimes dominates indisputably, obviously depending on the number of seats it controls. Since the late 1990s, this gridlock has been larger and larger. Politics have become the most divisive in the nation's modern history. Culture wars are at an all-time high, and much of the lawmakers' time is built on obstructionism and partisanship games rather than policy making. Just look at this chart. This is in contrast to China, which holds an autocratic system of government. Under an autocratic system, there is no substantial separation of powers, no free and fair elections, or checks on the head of state, at least not in practice. America's democracy has been highly successful in preventing authoritarianism and strengthening key institutions such as the courts, military, police, diplomatic corps, and others in a peaceful and orderly manner. But when it comes to the cost of stifling rapid policy changes and the implementation of infrastructure projects, you can see how this becomes a serious issue. This is part of the reason why Congress is so deeply despised by much of the American public, being about as popular as genital crabs and lice. Another reason for the legislative malaise is the role of lobbying. Ever since the Supreme Court ruling of Buckley v. Valeo, which ruled that expenditure limits on campaign contributions were unconstitutional, corporations and their lobbyists have been allowed to provide vast sums of campaign donations to their preferred candidates, who, if elected, will oftentimes do their bidding. This was expanded by another Supreme Court case called Citizens United versus FEC. This allows corporations, nonprofits, and unions to provide vast sums of wealth to candidates, who they can then use that money to fund campaign ads, which in local elections gives them a massive advantage. This is not so much of an issue during the presidential election, as there is so much free media. But in more obscure elections, the candidates getting more money from donations almost always win. This results in a system where people winning elections and taking up seats of power are less interested in serving their voters than they are in serving their corporate lobbyists. I would go as far as to say that campaign finance reform is the most important issue in American politics today, as it seeps into nearly every other problem. This makes it very difficult to pass any substantial policy measures in which there is a significant opposition. It makes it hard to regulate the prices for medication, in order to prevent pharmaceutical companies from jacking up prices when many politicians are being funded by those same companies. Want to build eco-friendly infrastructure? Well, it's sometimes hard to do that when fossil fuel companies are funding many of the campaigns of many politicians. There is also a revolving door between big business and government. Many politicians who receive these large donations or get them indirectly from super PACs, and they'll oftentimes get hired by those same companies once they're out of office. Over the years, more power has shifted away from Congress and towards the presidency. This has especially been the case in foreign policy. Constitutionally, Congress must declare war, but in practice this hasn't really been true. Several presidents have taken part in military action, sometimes without the approval of Congress. This has continued even with the War Powers Resolution, which sought to check the president's power to use armed forces without the consent of Congress. And this leads me to our next topic, the military. Nearly everyone knows that the US is currently the world's undisputed military power. It is the most technologically advanced and is the second largest in the world after China. The military is divided into the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and the non-combatant Coast Guard. Oh, and there's also a Space Force, apparently. The military acts as a non-partisan entity that tries its best to distance itself from the internal politics of Washington, D.C. For this reason, nearly all secretaries of defense have been from civilian backgrounds, with noticeable exceptions from the Trump and Biden administrations in recent years. It's worth noting that nuclear weapons are not administered by the Defense Department, but rather the Energy Department. The potential use of nuclear weapons is divided into three, oftentimes called the nuclear triad. These methods include the ground-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, aircraft, and submarines, land, air, and sea. The US, like most other nations, seeks to avoid nuclear proliferation, which basically means the spread of nuclear weapons. For this reason, it tends to provide more defense for certain allies that are under the threat of an adversary's nukes. The most notable example of this is the nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan. This prevents US allies from acquiring their own nuclear weapons, as that would just increase the likelihood of countries going to war using nuclear weapons. The US operates nearly 800 military bases of varying sizes across 70 countries on 6 continents. Some of the heaviest concentrations are in Europe, namely the UK, Germany, Italy, Greece, and Turkey. These are primarily there to counter the threat of Russia. The Asia-Pacific region is also home to a large concentration of military bases, namely in countries like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia. These exist to primarily protect sea lanes and counter China. And the third major region is in the Middle East, where the US operates bases in Tunisia, all nearby Gulf states, Jordan, and Israel. This is to counter Iran and gain access to hydrocarbon resources. These military bases are highly controversial. Some see them as necessary in order to provide protection for key allies, while others see them as a form of imperialism. These bases are usually, but not always, at the behest of the hosting countries. Some have compared American military bases to European colonialism. However, there are some key differences. American military bases are a far more insular affair. Soldiers hosted in them usually don't interact with the surrounding populace and usually keep to themselves. This is unlike European colonialism, which was led by white men intimately familiar with the lands that they were governing and far more willing to use force to control the surrounding lands and extract resources. US military bases, on the other hand, do not extract resources, and they also cost the American taxpayer a lot of fucking money. Much of the nearby populations of these bases take issue with the supposed violation of sovereignty, while their governments oftentimes see it as a way to freeload off of American security. This has led to growing skepticism among the left and the right in the US regarding its common use of military force. Many liberals and progressives prefer a more multilateral diplomatic approach, while many on the right prefer a more isolationist approach. Whether this growing skepticism of American military intervention and the widespread use of military bases among the general public will last, only time will tell. One of the most important elements of the American military is DARPA, or the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. This operates under the Defense Department, essentially acting as its research and development wing. The department has played a pivotal role in a wide array of military technologies and even laid the groundwork for the internet. Say what you will about the horrors of war, the threat of other military powers prompts the invention of cutting-edge technology, which can be applied to civilian use later on, bolstering not only the nation's defense, but also its economy, efficiency, and well-being. These technological advances, combined with very keen military doctrines, make the American Army, Navy, and Air Force a formidable power. With an Air Force that can hit nearly any target on Earth, a blue water Navy that can take control of the high seas and protect international sea routes, along with special forces that can effectively perform the most dangerous tasks, no country poses an existential threat to the United States without the use of nuclear weapons. As a result, the US has had many successes in military interventions as far as neutralizing their opponents goes. But defeating the enemy and resolving conflicts are two different matters. These nation-building methods worked well in Japan and Germany, developed nations with a strong sense of national identity, but in nations like Iraq, which were just byproducts of European colonial greed, nation-building was a total failure. Due to these blunders, many people at home and abroad call for the withdrawal of US forces from most, if not all, of these bases. A tampering down of military force can definitely happen, but a complete withdrawal is highly unlikely, especially in hot-button areas like South Korea. Furthermore, the disengagement of the military-based system under a very short period of time would most likely cause a recession, along with a spike in unemployment as troops come home and government spending is reduced. These military blunders have weakened the nation's treasury and morale nonetheless. Speaking of the treasury, let's move on to the US military budget. The US military budget is by far the highest in the world. Most of the following 10 countries on the list are allies. Granted, part of the reason why the military budget is so high is because many of these allies are freeloading off of American security. Overall, the main reason for this overly bloated military budget is a concept that most of you have already heard of, the military-industrial complex. This was a term coined by Eisenhower during his farewell address. In it, he warned of a close relationship between the military, elected officials, private defense contractors, and the scientific establishment. The private defense contractors lobby elected officials and give campaign contributions in order to make it more likely that they'll sign contracts and vote in favor of increasing defense budgets. Along with this, the scientific establishment centered around STEM-oriented universities like MIT and Stanford play a very important role in the military-industrial complex, as many engineers, computer scientists, and other people in STEM fields have worked in R&D wings of major corporations that operate as defense contractors. This massive budget, on one hand, makes the military an unstoppable force. However, it also acts as a drain on the economy and siphons funds away from needed social programs and domestic infrastructure. Which leads us to our next section, the economy. The US, as of the making of this video, is the largest economy on the planet. Something which may change by the time you're watching this. Overall, the US is a mixed economy, like nearly every other country on the planet, combining public and private elements together. The United States was not always the economic powerhouse that it is today. The US was widely regarded as an economic backwater by Europeans before the Civil War. But by the time the Reconstruction was over, the size of the economy would skyrocket, surpassing all others by the turn of the 20th century. This came about as the US was one of the first to industrialize, only trailing behind Britain and a few others. This economic dominance grew even greater at the end of World War II, as nearly all of the other great nations were in shambles. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe kept much of the European market open to American goods, which continued to bolster American exports and growth. However, the golden age of capitalism, which lasted from 1945 to the early 70s, didn't last. The burden of the Vietnam War, the OPEC crisis, and stagflation, along with growing concerns over the environment and peak oil, broke the long optimism. While this was happening, the American economy was moving away from an industrial economy to a service and knowledge-based economy. This would boom during the 1990s. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, global stability improved, and international trade skyrocketed. Many American business icons like Coca-Cola and McDonald's were mostly relegated to expanding in other capitalist democracies like Canada, Japan, Australia, and Western European nations. However, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, new markets and opportunities for trade opened up. On top of this, many people in the Third World had been lifted out of poverty, and many young people wanted to embrace American cultural exports like music, movies, food, fashion, and most of all, technology. The proto-internet had been partially developed by the American military, but with the collapse of the USSR, which eased global tensions, and the help of some really smart people, the digital revolution was born. Soon enough, we saw the rise of mega companies like Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, and Google, along with some fallen titans like AOL. This ensured that American economic and technological hegemony wasn't going away anytime soon. Cities with large concentrations of tech companies like San Francisco and Seattle became global powerhouses, replacing the industrial Rust Belt cities as the centers of innovation. Meanwhile, those very same former industrial cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Milwaukee were hit very hard, many of them losing a bulk of their factory jobs that were shipped overseas to China and other countries, in part due to free trade agreements that were opened up during the 90s. This led to a tremendous amount of pain and resentment towards globalization and the federal government that still exists to this day. While blue-collar jobs were dwindling, many switched in the service sector to pink-collar jobs, which are usually not unionized and receive very few benefits, if at all. In order to make up for this, many Americans have been entering colleges and universities to gain degrees. This is coupled with a larger information-based economy that we've seen across much of the developed world. However, going to university is expensive, and student loan debt is a major issue for many millennials, who are already having a harder time finding steady work, while their boomer parents were far more likely to get lifelong employment. These economic difficulties have already caused a delay in major purchases like home and car ownership, and it's also delayed the extent to which people start having families. Nonetheless, the US faces a far better demographic outlook than nearly all the major powers. The population growth is steadily increasing in a manageable manner, due in large part to immigration, of which the US does very well in assimilating newcomers. Meanwhile, many European powers would have declining populations if not for immigration, and those very same European powers have had a very hard time assimilating the migrants they do get. Other powers like Russia and Japan are already shrinking, and China is set to plateau their population and then fall in the coming decades. India, on the other hand, is too large to be sustainable given the country's poor infrastructure. These demographic trends will be a major advantage for American economic power in the coming decades. The US is also proved to be more energy independent than previously thought, as natural gas and oil extraction has expanded, along with renewable energy. This will probably result in less American military presence in the Middle East. Green infrastructure may cause its own economic growth spurt in the coming decades as new technology is put to use, improving efficiency. Meanwhile, the US also takes part in a wide array of trade relationships across the world. Under American hegemony, global trade networks have been extremely complex and interconnected, as many of the household items you own have been in more countries than you have. However, its trade networks are not as impressive as China's. More countries have China as their largest trading partner than the US. This is partially due to cheap Chinese goods, and the fact that the Chinese economy is currently still an export economy since their native population just doesn't have the disposable income yet to be buying massive goods from outside. China is currently dependent on the American Navy to protect shipping routes. However, this might not last forever, as China is now embracing the Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to expand terrestrial trade routes across the Eurasian landmass. The American and Chinese economies have been heavily interlinked since the 1990s, as the Clinton administration believed that bringing trade and capital to China would loosen its autocratic system. The Chinese government was more than happy to adopt many facets of capitalism, but entirely opposed to democracy. Millions upon millions of Chinese people have been pushed out of poverty since that time, but the Chinese authoritarian government has only tightened this grip. The differences in political and cultural values, along with economic issues like China's currency manipulation and stealing of intellectual property from the US along with other democratic nations, continues to be a hindrance to friendly relations. Relations between the two countries are getting uglier, and as a result of trade wars and other concerns, there has been some level of disengagement between the two economies. At this stage, it's hard to tell whether this is a rough patch in the relationship or the beginning of a bipolar world order, similar to what we saw in the Cold War. One area where the threat of a bipolar world is possible is in technology. When the US continues to be the global leader in technology, China has proved to be formidable in setting up internet infrastructure, 5G networks, and high-tech manufacturing. Currently, China is among the most digitally isolated nations on the planet. Most major non-Chinese websites are blocked in China, like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Google, Yahoo, and Tinder. China has its own set of websites that operate as replacements. This allows the Chinese Communist Party to restrict outside information and suppress internal dissent. China continues to be technologically isolated, but this will probably decrease as time goes by, as China has invested in internet infrastructure in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, verifiably tying them to the Chinese technology. Well, at least in theory. While China has made great strides in technological development, it is unlikely to surpass the US anytime soon. Many of these Chinese advances have been aided through the use of spying and stealing of intellectual property from more developed nations. To be clear, China has a very closed system, and its opaque nature makes it very difficult to get any accurate assessment of the country. This situation might lead to a bipolar digital age, but I doubt it would lead to Chinese hegemony, as their system is too closed off to promote widespread international adoption. The rise of automation will most likely also hit China harder than North America, Europe, and Japan, as manufacturing jobs of which China is still dependent on will most likely be in short supply as automation kicks off. Speaking of technology, one area that the US is still the leader in and arguably only beaten out by Russia is in intelligence operations. The US has 16 intelligence agencies, the two most important of which are the CIA and the NSA. You have already heard of the CIA, which spies and orchestrates coups. However, the NSA is actually larger and arguably more important as it collects unimaginable amounts of metadata. Despite this massive and questionable surveillance network, these intelligence agencies are far from perfect in terms of executing what they're actually meant to do. For example, none of the major agencies were able to detect the fact that the Soviet Union was about to collapse in 1991. Even though the signs should have been obvious at the time. Lastly, before I conclude, it is worth briefly speaking about soft power. US power is not simply relegated to tanks and treasuries, but also to the enormous amount of cultural influence it exerts on language, education, new media, movies, TV, music, games, food, and even values like individuality and personal freedom. American soft power does get the occasional criticism, but overall it tends to be very popular abroad, even in places with populations that view American political power negatively. But that's the thing with soft power. It's soft. Anger with American political or military policy usually doesn't have a major effect or influence on the praise and consumption of American cultural products and customs abroad. US foreign policy was viewed with widespread distaste during the Bush years, but that didn't place a major damper on movie ticket sales, album sales, or KFC franchises abroad. Likewise, no one is going to change their mind on American military posturing just because they like blue jeans and Twix bars. So what do we conclude from here? I've seen a wide variety of opinions, some of whom claim that the US will remain the world's sole superpower throughout the rest of the century, while others go as far as to predict the collapse of the US. Neither of these scenarios is likely. Since the collapse of the USSR, the US has been the world's sole superpower. However, only having one superpower is not the norm. Throughout much of history, there have been usually a number of varying powers competing with shifting alliances. I personally predict that the world will most likely be multipolar, with the US still retaining a significant amount of economic, military, technological, and cultural influence, but will also probably share great power status with China, India, the EU, and possibly Russia. With its geographic isolation, vast resources, stable demographics, and strong institutions, the idea of the US dwindling down into irrelevancy just isn't gonna happen unless there's some cataclysmic black swan event. However, with the rise of other powers, the US relative power will decline, even though they won't decline in the absolute sense. Currently, it's hard to tell at what rate this will happen. China and India have shown enormous growth and progress, but both countries still have very poor rural populations, and China's system of information distribution is so opaque that it's hard to trust much of the information about their economic growth that we all hear about. Russia, in contrast to India and China, is a declining power facing serious demographic crises among others. Meanwhile, other powers I've talked about, like Japan and the EU, tend to be heavily dependent on American leadership, at least for the time being. If the US is going to continue being competitive, it needs to address a number of challenges. It's hard to be the leader of the free world when the democratic system at home is so mired in partisanship, inaction, legalized bribery, and misinformation. The US can continue to be at the cutting edge of technology, but this will probably require bringing in large swaths of educated students and workers from countries like India and China. The US will also have to balance between not becoming an insular country disinterested in the affairs of the rest of the world, while avoiding the endless military quagmires that have cost so many lives and resources. These measures should be taken if the US can still hold on to its power by the beginning of the 22nd century. But hey, that's just my take. I'll be dead by the time this century is over, and no one will be able to tell me I'm wrong.